Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases in history. There are stories that don't make sense, and events that are still mysterious even after a long time. What we're going to talk about today happened in the Appalachian Mountains, in a remote area where silence is often more powerful than words. West Virginia's mountains have always had a strange feel to them. There are deep valleys, thick fog that creeps between the pine trees, and a sense of being alone that makes any sound echo in a strange way. In this place, a small stone chapel was built in 1887. A group of nuns built the place as a spiritual retreat, away from the cities that were getting bigger. It took months to build, and the stones were taken from the mountain itself. Each block was carried by hand along narrow paths. That fall afternoon, Mary Whitlock came to the chapel. She was from a poor family and wanted to find meaning in a life of contemplation. The first few months went by without any problems. The nuns prayed, worked, and stayed quiet every day. The chapel was on top of a hill and was surrounded by old trees that looked like they were guarding secrets from thousands of years ago. In the winter, the snow covered everything, cutting the place off from the rest of the world. But things started to change the next spring. During nightly prayers, Mary began to show signs of restlessness. Her friends saw that she would stare at the stone walls as if she were listening to something that no one else could hear. At first, they thought it was because they were tired, or because life in a monastery was so hard. But the signs became clearer. Mary started getting up in the middle of the night and walking to the chapel, even when there was no ceremony planned. Mary only said that she needed to be there when the other nuns tried to talk to her. She didn't say why or what she was feeling. She just kept saying that something was calling her. The Mother Superior, who was a strong woman, chose to keep a close eye on her. For weeks, she watched Mary closely to figure out what was making her act that way. What she saw really upset her. The Mother Superior followed Mary to the chapel on a very cold night. The young nun came in by herself, knelt down in front of the altar, and stayed still for hours. But she wasn't just praying. Her lips were moving quickly, as if she were talking to someone. And then, in a moment that the Mother Superior would never forget, Mary turned her head to the side wall of the chapel and smiled. It wasn't a smile of peace or devotion. It was something else. Like they were waiting for something. Things in the chapel started to get worse from that point on. Other nuns said they heard whispers in the early morning hours that sounded like they were coming from inside the walls. No one could make out any clear words, just constant whispers that kept them up at night. Mary, on the other hand, grew more and more distant. She spent hours in the chapel, even during the day, talking to the walls as if she were having a deep and meaningful conversation with them. The Mother Superior wrote to the bishop of the diocese to tell him what had happened and ask for advice. It took weeks for the reply to get there because the postal service in that mountainous area was having problems. When it finally got there, it had a clear order: watch, write down, but don't make big changes. The bishop thought it could be a spiritual test that Mary had to go through by herself. But the voices kept going, and Mary Whitlock seemed to get more and more lost in them. She slowly drifted away from the real world and into a deep hole that no one could understand. The stone chapel, which was built as a place of peace, was changing into something else entirely. This is only the beginning of the dark story that shook the mountains of West Virginia. The routine of that lonely chapel changed completely in the months that followed. Mary Whitlock started to spend most of her free time with the stone walls, gently touching them as if she could feel something that wasn't normal. The other nuns watched from a distance, torn between worry and a growing fear that no one would dare to admit to. The Mother Superior then chose to be more direct. One summer morning, she sat next to Mary at breakfast and asked her firmly what was going on. The answer came in a voice that was so low, it was almost a whisper. Mary said that the walls held stories from long ago that needed to be told again. She talked about voices that told stories about the mountain even before the chapel was built, and about people who had walked on that land long before the stones were stacked. That made me feel uneasy. The Mother Superior tried to say that stones don't remember things, and that Mary might just have been too tired and needed to rest. The young nun, on the other hand, just smiled with that same distant look and turned her attention back to the walls of the refectory. At that moment, the Mother Superior understood that Mary wasn't just tired or confused. She really believed what she was saying. Things got even stranger when other nuns started to tell similar stories. First was Sister Agnes, a middle-aged woman who had always been very logical. During afternoon prayer, she said she heard whispers that seemed to come from behind the altar. Sister Catherine then said that she could feel the stone of the wall shake a little under her hand during morning mass. The Mother Superior kept a personal diary in which she wrote down everything that happened in an effort to keep some control over things. She wrote down every story, every strange thing that happened, and every time the nuns acted differently. But as she wrote more, she realized that it didn't fit any known pattern. It wasn't easy to explain what was going on in that chapel, which was lost in the mountains. Mary, on the other hand, was getting deeper and deeper into her own world. During her long nightly vigils in the chapel, she started to ask questions out loud, as if she thought the walls would answer. She wondered about the history of that place, who had walked there before, and the secrets that were hidden under the stone foundations. Mary seemed to get clear answers, even though no one else did. One night, the Mother Superior chose to go with Mary to one of these vigils. She sat on the last bench and watched in silence as the young nun stood in front of the side wall. Even though it was the middle of summer, the air was cold. A strange draft moved through the chapel, making the candles flicker in strange ways. The Mother Superior heard the words for the first time then. They weren't clear. They were more like echoes from far away, bits of sounds that could be voices or just the sound of wind blowing through the cracks in the old stones. But there was something about those sounds, a pattern that seemed almost planned. The Mother Superior felt a chill run down her spine. For the first time, she really thought about the possibility that Mary wasn't just making things up. There might have been something real in those voices that didn't make sense to anyone. The Mother Superior paid more attention to what was going on in the days that followed. She started to write down the exact times, the weather, and the moon's position when the events happened. She looked for a pattern or a natural reason that would help her mind settle down. But the information only made things worse for her. The voices seemed to come out of nowhere, with no connection to anything else. They showed up on clear and stormy nights, hot afternoons, and cold mornings, and there was no clear difference between them. Mary, on the other hand, seemed to be getting more and more comfortable with her situation. The other nuns looked scared or uncomfortable, but she seemed strangely calm. She said the voices were soft and told interesting stories about that land. She talked about old people who lived in the mountains, traditions that have been forgotten, and wisdom that has been lost over time. It all sounded too good to be true, but Mary told it with such conviction that it was impossible not to feel upset. The chapel in the West Virginia mountains had become a place of deep mystery, and Mary Whitlock was at the center of that mystery, growing more and more connected to something that no one else could fully understand. The stone walls kept their secrets, and she seemed determined to find out what they were, no matter what. Autumn had come, and the mountains were full of bright colors, but inside the chapel, the mood was still heavy and sad. Mary Whitlock had a strange routine that both fascinated and bothered the people around her. She would stay in the chapel alone for hours, after the last prayers every night. She always sat next to the same part of the sidewall, which was made of darker stones that looked like they came from a different part of the mountain. The Mother Superior grew more and more worried as she watched everything. She had looked through some old books in the chapel library to see if other religious groups had similar stories. She read vague stories about strange things happening in remote areas, but nothing that was exactly like what she was seeing. The books talked about spiritual tests, hidden temptations, and real gifts that some people had that let them see beyond the normal veil of reality. During this time, Mary started to tell more about what she was hearing. One rainy afternoon, while she was helping to make dinner, she casually said that the voices talked about an old community that lived in that valley long before Europeans came. She talked about ceremonies done under the stars, chants that echoed off the rocky peaks, and a deep connection to the land that had been lost to time. All told with such rich detail that it seemed impossible that it was just something she thought up. Some of the other nuns were interested, while others looked uncomfortable. Sister Agnes wanted to know how Mary could know these things, if the voices really said what they did, or if she was just making it up. The answer was calm and sure. The voices were as clear as day to her, coming from the stones that held the memory of everything that had happened there. Mary touched the wall of the kitchen, which was her trademark gentle touch, and said that each stone had a story to tell. The Mother Superior then decided to write to the bishop again, this time with a much more detailed and urgent account. She talked about not only how Mary acted, but also what the other nuns went through, the strange noises, and the chapel's atmosphere getting heavier and heavier. She asked for someone with more experience in spiritual matters to come and look into it themselves because she couldn't understand or deal with the situation. A traveler, who sometimes climbed the mountain to bring supplies, brought the letter. While they waited for an answer, something amazing happened. A strong storm hit the area, with winds that howled through the valleys and rains that turned the trails into rivers of mud. The chapel stayed strong on its stone foundation, but the noise outside was so loud it hurt. During the worst night of the storm, a group of nuns gathered in the common room to comfort each other as nature raged outside. Mary was in the chapel, as you might expect. The Mother Superior went to get her because she was worried that the young nun might be scared or in danger. But when she walked into the chapel, she saw something she would never forget. Mary stood in front of the wall, calm, even though the wind shook the windows and the rain hit the roof. She moved her lips quickly, but not in the way that people usually pray. She talked and moved her hands a little, as if she were having a lively conversation with someone who wasn't there. And the most troubling thing was that she didn't seem to notice the storm going on outside at all. Before she got her attention, the Mother Superior called her name a few times. When Mary finally turned around, her face showed an expression of complete peace, almost glowing. She said that the voices were especially clear during the storm, as if the elements of nature made her hearing better. She said she was learning amazing things about that place, like how there are layers of history that are like layers of rock in the mountain. That was enough for the Mother Superior. She told Mary that she had to come back to the common room with her, at least until the storm was over. Mary didn't want to obey for the first time. She said she had to stay there because the voices had something important to say that night. But the Mother Superior's power won out, and Mary finally gave in, even though she didn't want to. The nuns stayed up all night in the common room, wrapped in blankets and surrounded by the warmth of a small fire. Mary stayed quiet in a corner, her eyes blank, clearly wanting to go back to the chapel. The other people whispered to each other, wondering what was really going on. Some people stood up for Mary and said that she might have a special gift. Some people were scared and thought it might be best to send the young nun to another convent where she could get the help she needed. The Mother Superior heard everything without getting in the way. Her own thoughts were all over the place. Part of her wanted to believe a logical explanation, that Mary had some kind of imbalance that made her hear things that weren't there. But another part, the one that had seen the events happen, couldn't completely rule out the idea that something truly strange was happening in that chapel deep in the Appalachian Mountains. Mary was the first to get up when the storm finally stopped just before dawn. She walked straight to the chapel without saying a word. The Mother Superior followed, but she stayed a respectful distance behind. She saw Mary kneel down in front of the wall, put both hands on the stone, and shut her eyes. The room was very quiet, which was very different from how it had been the night before. And in that quiet, even the Mother Superior seemed to hear something. A whisper so low it could only be the wind, but it had a strange pattern, almost like words spoken from far away. In the days that followed, the community's dynamics changed in a small but noticeable way. The nuns stopped spending a lot of time alone in the chapel. Some people told the Mother Superior that they felt like someone was watching them when they were there, like invisible eyes were following them. Some people talked about strange dreams, in which they saw people dressed differently walking through those same hallways a long time ago. Mary, on the other hand, seemed to be more and more lost in her own world and less involved in the community's daily life. After weeks of waiting, the bishop's answer finally came. The letter was short and to the point. A priest, who was good at spiritual discernment, would go to see the situation for himself. He was supposed to get there within a month, when the trails got better after the rainy season. The Mother Superior was to keep track of everything until then, and make sure that Mary didn't do anything that could put herself or others in danger. But a month felt like forever in that chapel, where time had started to act strangely. There were times when the hours seemed to go on forever, and times when whole days went by in the blink of an eye. Mary kept talking to the walls and the voices in her head without saying anything. It seemed like those invisible beings that lived in the old stones were leading everything toward some kind of revelation that was yet to come. There was a quiet tension in every corner of the chapel in the weeks leading up to the priest's arrival. Mary Whitlock had become a strange figure in the community, both far away and hard to ignore. Her friends watched her with a mix of curiosity and fear, never knowing what she would do next. The monks went about their business as usual, but there was a different feeling in the air, as if everyone was waiting for something that would happen. During this time, the Mother Superior chose to stay with Mary more closely during her nightly vigils. She wanted to know more about what happened when she was alone by the stone walls. She wanted to see and hear for herself what Mary said with such certainty. She always sat a few meters away on one of the back benches of the chapel, quietly watching as the young nun had her strange conversations. The Mother Superior learned some interesting and disturbing things during those nights. Mary wasn't just talking to the walls. She really acted like someone was listening. She stopped at the right times, like someone who was paying close attention before moving on. She would smile at times and frown at others, as if she were trying to figure out complicated information. She would sometimes tilt her head, which is a common way for someone to try to hear something that is far away or being whispered. She thought everything was real. One night, the Mother Superior made the decision to come up. She walked slowly until she was next to Mary, who at first didn't seem to notice her. The young nun was completely focused, with one hand resting gently on the stone and her eyes closed. She was breathing normally and calmly. The Mother Superior put her hand on the wall next to Mary's and closed her eyes as well. She tried to clear her mind of thoughts and be open to whatever was there, even if it couldn't be seen by normal senses. For a long time, nothing happened. The only sound was the deep silence of the mountain night, which was broken now and then by the hoot of an owl. But then, just as she was about to give up, the Mother Superior felt something. It wasn't really a sound or a physical vibration. It was more like a presence, a feeling that there was something beyond that stone wall, something old and patient that was just there, watching and waiting. The Mother Superior's heart raced. She quickly opened her eyes. Her breathing was uneven, and she pulled her hand away from the wall as if she had touched something too hot. At that moment, Mary opened her eyes and stared right at her. That look showed that they understood each other, in a way that was quiet. Then the Mother Superior knew that Mary wasn't crazy, and that she wasn't lying. There was really something in that chapel that couldn't be explained in simple terms. The question was no longer if the voices were real, but what they were and what they wanted. The Mother Superior was in a tough spot in the days that followed. She couldn't tell the other nuns about what she had been through without causing a lot of panic or confusion, and she couldn't just forget about it. She chose to wait for the priest to arrive, hoping that someone with more knowledge and power could make things clearer in that strange situation. Mary kept talking to the people at night, and she became more and more sure of herself and more involved in that world that only she could see. Mary started to talk about what the voices were for during this time. At breakfast one morning, she casually said that the voices wanted to find something. She didn't say what it was, just that there was something important hidden in the chapel's foundations that needed to be brought to light. The other nuns looked at each other nervously, but no one dared to ask her. But the Mother Superior was very interested. The Mother Superior took Mary into her small office after the meal for a private talk. She asked the voices directly what they wanted to tell her, and what this secret that was supposed to be hidden in the foundations was. Mary said she wasn't sure yet because the information came in bits and pieces, like pieces of a puzzle she was slowly putting together. But she said something about things buried in the ground, memories that were kept in the ground beneath the chapel, and a story that needed to be told. The Mother Superior thought carefully about what she was going to say next. She wanted to know if it would be smart or even okay to start digging in the chapel's foundations. Mary shook her head and said that it wasn't always about digging up the ground. The voices didn't want anything to be broken. They just wanted someone to know they were there, listen to their stories, and keep them in some way. It was more about seeing than about finding things. This answer made the Mother Superior feel better, but it also made her think of new questions. If the voices just wanted to be heard, why did they pick Mary? Why did that young nun stand out from the rest? Mary wasn't sure, but she thought it might have something to do with being open and willing to listen without judging right away. She said that a lot of people spend their whole lives closed off to anything they can't explain right away, but she always let herself question, imagine, and accept things that were strange. When the priest finally got there, the first signs of winter started to show. He looked tough, but his eyes were kind. He had a small suitcase with books and tools that the Mother Superior didn't know about. He only gave his name as Father Thomas and said he was there at the bishop's request to check on things. The chapel's mood changed right away when he showed up. The nuns greeted him with respect and hope, hoping he would bring answers or at least a clear path forward. At first, Father Thomas just watched. He went to prayers, ate with everyone, and walked around the chapel's halls and grounds. He talked to each nun for a short time and asked them simple questions about what they did every day and how they felt. Everyone in the chapel was on edge, waiting to see what would happen when he finally called Mary aside for a private talk. Father Thomas and Mary talked for hours. It happened in the chapel, with both of them sitting in front of the wall where Mary slept at night. The Mother Superior watched from a distance and couldn't hear what was being said, but she could see how the people were acting. The priest paid close attention and took notes in a small notebook from time to time. Mary pointed to different parts of the wall as she spoke, showing how passionate she was about what she was saying. Father Thomas put his hand on the stone at one point, closed his eyes, and stayed still for a few minutes. When Father Thomas finally stood up, his face was hard to read. He didn't seem worried or clearly agree. He seemed more confused, as if he had just seen something that went against what he thought would happen. He said goodbye to Mary with a polite nod, and then went straight to find the Mother Superior. What they talked about at that moment would set the tone for everything that would happen next. Father Thomas started by saying that he had found something real in Mary, something that couldn't be easily written off as a trick of the mind or a mental illness. He had felt something when he touched the wall, something small but real. But he stressed that not every presence is good, and that it was important to be careful when trying to figure out what was really in that chapel. He suggested that they do a series of more in-depth observations in the next few weeks before making a final recommendation to the bishop. The Mother Superior agreed, happy to finally have someone else help her with that heavy responsibility. But he also felt a twinge of fear. The fact that even an experienced priest saw something real there meant that the situation was much worse than she had thought. The chapel in the Appalachian Mountains, a place of peace and quiet, had become the scene of something amazing that went against all rules and guidelines. Father Thomas set up a strict schedule for observing that changed the way the chapel worked. Every night he put himself in a corner where he could see everything going on without getting in the way of Mary's work. He had a special candle and a notebook with him, and he wrote down every little thing with almost obsessive accuracy. The Mother Superior often went with him, and they both stayed quiet while Mary talked to the stone walls. The priest started to see patterns that he hadn't seen before during these vigils. He noticed that Mary always went to the same 3 parts of the sidewall and never moved. He said that the most intense episodes always happened on nights when there was a new moon, when it was the darkest and quietest. He also wrote that the temperature in the chapel seemed to drop a few degrees when Mary was most focused on her conversations that no one else could hear. But what really interested Father Thomas was that he had started to pick up bits of what Mary heard so clearly. They weren't separate voices. They didn't sound like words that could be understood. It was more like echoes of feelings, thoughts that came to him without any clear source. He felt like he was in a different dimension, with sensations of the past, untold stories, and people who were there but not in the same way. This made him very uncomfortable, but he couldn't ignore it. Father Thomas talked to Mary for a long time about what she had been through during the day. He wanted to know more about the voices, not just what they said, but also how they said it. Mary said that it wasn't normal hearing, but a kind of direct knowledge that came to her mind. The voices didn't speak Portuguese or any other language she knew. Instead, they talked to her through pictures, feelings, and sudden realizations that came to her mind. Father Thomas was especially interested when Mary told him what the voices said about the land where the chapel was built. She said that place had been thought of as holy long before Europeans got there. People in the past held ceremonies there because they thought the mountain was a place where the visible world and something beyond it met. The dark stones that made up some parts of the wall weren't chosen at random. They were chosen because they already held memories of rituals and reverences that had been going on for thousands of years. Father Thomas was very upset by these new facts. He was a Catholic priest and had a hard time accepting the idea that places could remember spiritual practices that weren't Christian. But because of what he had seen in the chapel, he had to think about things he would normally have dismissed right away. There was something in those stones that went beyond religious groups or traditional theological ideas. It was just presence, old and still there. Father Thomas chose to do an experiment on a very cold afternoon. He asked Mary to help him meditate by the wall, hoping to help him connect with what she saw so easily. Mary said yes, but she warned that she didn't know if she could help anyone hear what she heard. They stood next to each other in front of the middle part of the wall, with their hands on the cold stone. Father Thomas would never officially tell the diocese what happened in the next few hours in his documents. He put his hands on the wall and tried to clear his mind of thoughts. That's when he started to feel something amazing. Images came to him not as memories of his own, but as windows to times long ago. He saw people dressed in very different ways moving in circles under a sky full of stars. He could tell how much those people cared about the place and how deeply connected they were to the land and the mountains. Father Thomas was clearly shaken when he finally opened his eyes. His hands shook a little as he stepped away from the wall. Mary watched him in silence, fully aware of what he had been through. The priest needed to sit down for a few minutes and take deep breaths to try to make sense of what had just happened. He was no longer unsure about whether or not the things that were happening were real. The question now was very different. How do you deal with this reality? In the days that followed, Father Thomas became noticeably more quiet and thoughtful. He was probably praying and thinking about what had happened to him for hours in his room. The Mother Superior tried to talk to him a few times, but he always gave vague answers, saying he needed more time to come to a decision. The other nuns saw that he was acting differently and started to wonder what it could mean. Mary, on the other hand, seemed to have found some comfort in the experience she had with Father Thomas. She wasn't the only one who heard the voices anymore. There was now someone else who could see, even if only a little bit, what she went through every night. This made her act a little differently. She talked to the other nuns more and tried to explain what had happened to her in a way that they could understand without being scared. Mary told everyone in the community something that the voices had just told her during dinner one night. She said that the chapel wasn't built there by chance. There was something that the men who chose that hill to build the structure didn't fully understand that led them there. There was something about that place that drew people to it, something that made them feel closer to God. The voices said that this quality had always been there, even before there were any Christian chapels. The nuns listened in silence, and some of them looked like they were uncomfortable with what those words meant. Sister Catherine, who was always the most practical of the group, asked Mary straight out if she thought the voices were spirits of dead people. Mary took her time before answering. She said she wasn't sure if they were spirits in the usual way. They seemed more like memories carved into the stones and earth over hundreds of years of reverence and focused attention. Father Thomas, who had been there for this conversation, finally spoke up after a long time. He said he had been thinking about hard theological questions that had to do with what they were going through. He said that the Church has always known that some places have a special quality or presence that helps people connect with the sacred. Examples of this are pilgrimage sites, old cathedrals, and grottos where saints meditated. The chapel's location was special because the stones seemed to hold memories that weren't Christian. This observation led to a heated argument between the priest and some of the older nuns. They wondered if it would still be okay to use that space for their religious activities if it somehow had the energies of different spiritual traditions in it. Father Thomas said that all of creation belonged to the same God, no matter how different people chose to worship him. The stones weren't good or bad on their own. They were just stones that had seen people looking for the sacred in different times and places. Mary was interested in everything that was said, but she didn't say anything. She knew that the voices didn't care about these differences in theology. They were just there, telling their stories to anyone who would listen. They didn't ask for people to worship them or turn down any kind of spirituality. They were patient witnesses to the passage of time, keeping memories that would have otherwise been lost forever. Mary thought her job was just to be the person who helped these memories finally be seen and honored. Winter had fully taken over the mountains, and the snow that fell covered everything in a quiet white blanket. The chapel became even more cut off, and the trails were closed for weeks. Father Thomas had planned to leave after a few weeks of observation, but he had to stay until the weather got better. This forced extension of his stay made him understand what was going on there much better. The chapel felt even more intense during the long winter nights when the wind howled outside and snow piled up against the windows. The nuns went to bed early to stay warm in their rooms, but Mary kept her night vigils going. The cold didn't seem to bother her as much as it did the others. She stayed in the cold chapel for hours, with only a thin shawl over her shoulders, lost in her silent conversations. During this time, Father Thomas started to notice something interesting. The voices Mary heard seemed to be more active in the winter. She said that the stories got richer and more detailed, as if the cold and isolation made it easier to talk to each other. The priest wondered if this had anything to do with the complete silence that winter brought, which could have made it easier for Mary to pick up on things that were going on around her. Father Thomas had an eye-opening talk with the Mother Superior on one of those very cold nights. They were both sitting by the fireplace in the common room, enjoying the warmth of the flames and thinking about everything they had seen. The Mother Superior admitted that her beliefs about what is real had been deeply shaken. She had always thought that the spiritual and material worlds were very different from each other, but Mary and the voices from the chapel were showing her that maybe this separation wasn't as clear as she had thought. Father Thomas agreed, saying that his own theological training had not prepared him well enough to deal with things like that. He had read about saints who had visions and people who heard calls from God, but this was different. Mary wasn't getting messages from angels or saints. Instead, she was tapping into something deeper, older, and more fundamental than anything else in the physical world. It was like she had learned how to read the history written in the things around her. Mary's sudden arrival interrupted the conversation. She rushed down from the chapel with a worried look on her face. She said that the voices had told her something important that Father Thomas needed to know. He and the Mother Superior looked at each other with concern, but they told Mary to keep going. The young nun took a deep breath and thought about what she was going to say. And Mary said that the voices had told her that they would not be in the chapel for long. He said that there were cycles, times when communication was possible, and times when memories went back to a deeper state of dormancy. This winter was the height of one of these cycles, when the lines between the past and the present began to blur. But when spring came, the voices would slowly fade away again, maybe for decades or even centuries. Father Thomas took this news more and more seriously. He asked Mary if the voices had said why they chose to show up at that time, in that winter. Mary said that it seemed to have to do with a number of things, one of which was her willingness to listen. The voices said that there was something about that time and place in history, as well as the people who were in the chapel at that moment, that made it the best time and place for communication. This new information put more pressure on everyone involved. It was getting close to spring, and if the voices were really going to be quieted, they had to hurry. Father Thomas thought it was his duty to write down everything as clearly as he could before the chance was gone. The Mother Superior agreed, but she was worried about how to tell the diocese this information in a way that wouldn't sound completely crazy. Father Thomas worked harder on his paperwork in the days that followed. He started meeting with Mary every day, and during those meetings she told him everything the voices said in great detail. He carefully wrote down every piece of information, including the symbols that Mary saw in her visions, descriptions of ancient ceremonies, and place names and ideas that were no longer used in any known language. The work was hard, but they both knew it was important. Mary said something during one of these sessions that made Father Thomas stop writing completely. The voices had said that there were other people in the mountains besides them. They said that this part of the Appalachians was crossed by invisible currents of energy, which made it easier for people to see through the veil between different realities. One of these points was where the chapel was built, but there were many others in the mountains, each with its own stories and memories. Father Thomas wanted to know if Mary knew where these other places were. She shook her head and said that the voices didn't give her this information so directly. It was always bits and pieces, never a clear map or step-by-step directions. But she thought that anyone who was sensitive enough could find these places if they knew what to look for and paid attention to the small signs the land gave them. This conversation made Father Thomas think a lot about what the sacred really is. He had always thought that the Church and its sacraments were the main ways that God showed himself, but he was now seeing proof that there were parts of the sacred that didn't need any organized religion to exist. It seemed like the earth had memory, some kind of consciousness, and the ability to remember and share experiences that had happened over the years. When the Mother Superior found out about these talks, she voiced her own worries. She was worried that these ideas might get misinterpreted or twisted if they got out. People might start looking for these mountain spots with bad intentions, or worse, people might become morbidly curious about the chapel itself. Father Thomas agreed that these worries were valid, but he also said that hiding the truth had its own problems. Mary, who was listening to the conversation, said that maybe the voices didn't want to be famous or get a lot of attention. They just wanted a few people to hear them who could understand and respect who they were. They didn't want to be loved or feared. They just wanted people to know that they had been around for a long time. Father Thomas thought this interpretation was very wise. He pointed out that the voices themselves showed humility, which was very different from other spiritual manifestations he had heard about. As winter reached its peak, the voices seemed to get even more active. Mary started to have experiences during the day, not just during the nighttime vigils. While she walked through the halls, she saw flashes of images. While she worked in the kitchen, she heard bits of old chants. And while she did her daily tasks, she felt like there were people with her who she couldn't see. It didn't scare her. It was just a natural way for her to feel more connected to that place and her memories. The other nuns had different reactions to these changes. Some people moved even further away from Mary, making it clear that they were not happy with the whole thing. Others became more interested and shyly asked her questions about what she was going through. Sister Agnes, in particular, became very interested in the event and started spending more time in the chapel herself, trying to understand a little bit of what Mary saw so clearly. Father Thomas watched everything with the same care as a researcher, but he also became more and more worried. He knew he would have to go back to the diocese and tell them what he had found out. How would he explain something that can't be explained? What would he say about experiences that didn't fit into any of the usual religious categories? And most importantly, what would he suggest for the future of Mary and the chapel? As winter went on, these questions became more and more important to him. During the middle of winter, there was a complete stillness that made time seem to stop. The snow built up in thick layers around the chapel, making it almost impossible to get to from the outside world. In this time of increased isolation, something amazing started to happen. Other nuns, not just Mary, began to share their own stories about the voices. The first was Sister Agnes, who had been getting more and more interested in the event. On a cold morning, she went to see the Mother Superior alone to tell her that she had felt something different during morning prayer. She said that even though the chapel was very cold, it felt like a warm presence that wrapped around her in silence. They weren't clear voices like Mary said. They were feelings and thoughts that came to her mind without her knowing where they came from. The Mother Superior paid more attention this time. She asked for more information to see if Sister Agnes was just suggesting something based on what she had seen with Mary, or if she was really going through something on her own. Agnes's description was very convincing because it was so specific. She said she felt a deep sadness, but it wasn't her own. It was like the place itself was sharing memories of loss and change. When Father Thomas heard about this new development, he became very interested. He had thought that Mary's ability might not be as special as it first seemed, and that other people might be able to develop similar sensitivity if they stayed in that charged environment for long enough. This theory seemed to be supported by Sister Agnes's experience. He asked to watch her pray again so he could see if the same thing would happen again. Over the next few days, 2 more nuns quietly came forward to say they had had similar experiences. Sister Catherine said she had dreamed of strange figures moving around the chapel and making gestures that looked like they were part of a ritual. Sister Beatrice, who was usually the most skeptical of the group, said she had heard what sounded like singing from far away as she walked down the hall at night, even though she knew all the other nuns were asleep. Mary felt both validated and worried when she heard this news. She was glad to know that she wasn't the only one who thought this way. On the other hand, she was worried about what this might mean. She told Father Thomas that the voices had said something about amplification, as if having open-minded people in that space all the time was somehow making the connection between worlds stronger. Father Thomas started holding group sessions with Mary and the other nuns so they could talk about and compare their experiences. He found interesting patterns in the way people talked to each other. Even though each nun told her story in a slightly different way, they all had some things in common: a sense of the past, feelings that clearly didn't come from their own lives, and memories of lives lived long ago. Mary suggested that everyone should try a joint experiment during one of these meetings. She suggested that they all meet in the chapel at night and stand against the wall, trying to open themselves up to whatever lived there at the same time. At first, Father Thomas was hesitant because he was worried about what might happen, but his scientific and spiritual curiosity won out. The Mother Superior carefully agreed, but only if she and Father Thomas kept a close eye on everything. The experience was set for the next new moon night, when Mary told them that the connection with the voices was usually stronger. After the last prayers, the 5 nuns who had shared their experiences met in the chapel. Father Thomas and the Mother Superior were nearby, watching closely but not getting involved. The air was even colder than usual, and everyone could see their breath in the cold air. Mary told the others to put their hands on the stones and let go of any thoughts they had about what would happen. They shouldn't try to make anything happen. They should just let things happen on their own. Nothing happened for a long time except the deep silence of the night in the mountains. But over time, the mood in the chapel began to shift. It felt like the temperature dropped even more, even though there was no draft. Sister Beatrice, one of the nuns, gasped in surprise. When Father Thomas asked what had happened, she said that she felt a slight vibration under her hands, as if the stone were alive in some way. Another nun said she felt something similar, a slow, rhythmic pulsing that didn't match up with any known physical process. Mary, who was in the middle of the group, seemed to be in deep communication with the voices. Her lips moved without making a sound, as if she were responding to something only she could hear. But now, the other nuns were also picking up pieces. Sister Agnes later said that she saw in her mind people dressed very differently bringing flowers and herbs to that same hill where the chapel now stands. The experience lasted almost an hour, and during that time, Father Thomas was fascinated by how the 5 nuns stayed silent and meditative, clearly lost in some shared experience that he could only partially understand. When they finally let go of the wall, they all looked different in some way, with their eyes showing a depth that hadn't been there before. In the days that followed, people in the chapel talked a lot about that shared experience. Each nun told what she had seen, and together they started to put together a fuller picture of the memories the stones held. They talked about ceremonies held under the stars, how they felt deeply connected to the cycles of nature, and how their respect for the earth went beyond any organized religion. But, strangely, it seemed to hold the essence of all true spiritual seeking. These descriptions really touched Father Thomas. He saw in them echoes of something that all people share, a desire for the sacred that showed up in different ways in different cultures and times, but that was basically the same at its core. He understood that the voices Mary and the others heard did not go against their Christian beliefs. Instead, they learned more about how many different ways the divine could show itself in human life. The Mother Superior, on the other hand, was not so sure. She was afraid that this growing openness to the voices would make the nuns less religious. But she was shocked to see the opposite happen. The nuns who had heard the voices showed a renewed devotion during prayers, as if their understanding of the sacred had grown rather than shrunk. Mary explained this in a way that the Mother Superior could understand. She said that the voices didn't try to replace God or any other form of faith. They were just witnesses to how people have always looked for God. Hearing their stories was like reading holy books from old religions, which could make your own faith stronger instead of weaker. The Mother Superior thought about these words carefully and started to see the situation in a new way. In the meantime, winter was starting to change. Even though spring was still weeks away from coming in full force, the days were getting longer without anyone noticing. Mary saw that the way the voices talked to each other had started to change in small ways. They weren't as productive anymore. They didn't tell stories as often or with as much detail. It seemed like they were slowly getting ready to be quiet again. Father Thomas's documentation work became even more important after he realized this. He spent more time with Mary, working late into the night to write down everything that could still be saved before they couldn't talk to each other anymore. The end result was a great collection of notes, drawings, and thoughts that not only showed what the voices were saying, but also how they had changed the lives of everyone who heard them. The change from winter to spring in the Appalachian Mountains is never sudden. The snow starts to melt slowly during the day and then refreezes at night. At first, you can't really see it happening. During this in-between time, things in the chapel took an unexpected turn, revealing even more layers of the mystery that had everyone hooked. Mary woke up one of those mornings when things were changing and felt like she had to do something right away but didn't know why. The voices had talked to each other in a different way during the night. Instead of telling stories or showing pictures, they had made a kind of call. She knew, even though she didn't know how she knew, that the voices wanted to show her something specific that required her to do something, not just think about it. Mary told Father Thomas and the Mother Superior about this feeling over breakfast. She said that she thought it was important to look into some parts of the chapel that hadn't gotten much attention before. It wasn't about digging or breaking anything. It was just about paying closer attention and looking for signs that might have always been there but had gone unnoticed. Father Thomas, who was always careful but also very curious, agreed to go with her on this search. They started with the oldest part of the chapel, which was the first part of the foundations to be built before the chapel was expanded. Mary walked slowly along the wall, running her hands over the stones with that characteristic light touch. She would stop every now and then and close her eyes, as if she were listening to or feeling something that told her what to do. Father Thomas watched with interest, taking mental notes of every gesture and pause. Mary stopped completely in a very dark part of the room, where the light from the windows didn't reach very often. She put both hands on a stone that was bigger than the others and had a color that was a little different. For a few minutes, she stayed still, breathing slowly and looking focused. Father Thomas could tell right away that there was a certainty in her eyes when she finally opened them. Mary said that this stone was unique and unlike any other in the chapel. She couldn't say for sure how she knew, but she thought the voices wanted to tell her something about it. Father Thomas walked over and looked at the stone closely. At first, it didn't seem very special. It was just one of the hundreds that made up the walls. But when he put his own hand on it, he felt something that made his heart race. There were marks on the stone surface that were so worn down by time that you could barely feel them when you touched them. But once someone knew they were there, they could be felt with care. They weren't natural formations. They were made by people a long time ago in a planned way. Father Thomas asked for more candles to be brought so he could look at it with more light. The carvings were easier to see with better lighting, but they were still very subtle. They looked like symbols of some kind, but Father Thomas didn't recognize any of them from his studies of ancient writing. Mary lightly touched the symbols and traced their shapes with her fingers. She said the voices were more active now, almost excited, as if this discovery meant something to her that she didn't fully understand yet. They called the Mother Superior to see what they had found. She also looked at the symbols, and her face changed from interest to worry. She wondered if the chapel's builders could have made those carvings as a blessing or a sign of dedication. But Father Thomas shook his head in disagreement. The ware made it look like it was much older than the chapel itself. The stone with strange symbols had been brought in from somewhere else and used in the building. It may have already had those marks for hundreds of years. Over the next few hours, a methodical search of the chapel took place. Other nuns joined in, and they all carefully looked at the walls for stones that looked like the ones they were looking for. They were all surprised to find 3 more stones that were similar to the others. They were all in specific places that, when mapped out in the chapel space, seemed to make some kind of geometric pattern. Mary spent the rest of the day moving from one of the 4 marked stones to the next, touching each one in turn and listening to what the voices had to say about them. She told everyone what she had learned at dinner that night. The voices said that those stones were part of a much older building that had been there for hundreds of years before the chapel. It wasn't a building in the usual sense. It was more like a stone circle where the people who lived in the mountains long ago would meet and hold ceremonies. Father Thomas was very interested in what he had just learned. He had heard stories about old stone structures in different parts of the world where people would gather to celebrate the solstices, do rituals, and connect with what they thought were sacred forces. He was deeply moved by the idea that one of these buildings might have been there, and that its parts were later used to build the Christian chapel. But that wasn't all. Mary said that the voices said that the chapel builders didn't just pick those stones at random, even if they didn't know why they were drawn to them. The stones had a spiritual quality that made them perfect for a holy place. It was as if the place itself had a will, gently guiding those who built it to honor, even if they didn't know it, what had been there before. This idea of continuity through time, of different ways of expressing the sacred overlapping and honoring each other even in very different cultures, had a big impact on everyone in the chapel. Sister Agnes said that it made the world seem less broken and more connected in some way. If so many different people, separated by hundreds of years, could find the same place sacred, maybe there was something about certain places that went beyond specific cultures. Father Thomas thought about the religious meaning of these discoveries for days. He wrote long entries in his journal about the nature of the sacred, how God showed himself in different times and cultures, and whether there were places on earth that were naturally more open to the divine. He didn't come to any final conclusions, but he did feel like he was learning things he never thought possible. Mary, on the other hand, kept vigil by the marked stones. She found that the voices got even clearer when she touched each one in a certain order, as if she were somehow turning on an old circuit. Other nuns who had become sensitive to the voices also saw this happen. They said that the sequence of touches seemed to create a resonance that made it easier to talk to each other. Mary said that during one of these sessions, she got the most important message from the voices she had heard so far. They said that being in the chapel wasn't an accident or a coincidence. They say that there were long periods, decades or even centuries, when they didn't say anything. But every now and then, when the time was right, and there were people who were willing to listen, they could tell their stories again. Mary thought that the point of this was not to get attention or praise. It was just to keep memories alive, to make sure that some ideas about the sacred and the connection between people and the earth didn't completely fade away over time. Every time they talked to someone like Mary, they planted seeds of knowledge that could grow into new understandings, even if it took a long time. This news deeply affected Father Thomas. He thought it was like his own mission, which he saw as part of his religious calling, to keep and pass on spiritual wisdom through the ages. He realized that the voices weren't that different from his own in this way. Both acted as links between the past and the future, keeping safe information that could be lost without careful efforts to keep it safe. After hearing all of this, the Mother Superior finally seemed to accept how strange the situation was. She said that God might work in ways that are much more varied and mysterious than any human theology could ever fully understand. If the voices helped people understand the sacred better instead of worse, then maybe they were part of God's plan in ways that no one could fully understand. Mary noticed the promised change in the voices as spring drew closer. The snow was melting faster, and the first signs of plant life were starting to appear. They were getting farther away, and their messages were getting shorter and more spaced out. It was like seeing a tide slowly go out, taking with it treasures that had only been seen on the shore of the present for a short time. Father Thomas worked harder on his paperwork because he knew he didn't have much time. He worked hard to write down not only what the voices said, but also how they changed the people who heard them. He thought that this human aspect was just as important as the historical or spiritual facts that had come to light. Spring had definitely come, and nature around the chapel was waking up. The birds came back to the mountains, the trees started to grow, and the trails were finally open again. Because of these changes in the outside world, the chapel and its inhabitants also had to change. Mary noticed the change more than anyone else. The voices that had been so clear and constant during the winter now only came in short, quiet whispers that were hard to hear and required a lot of focus to catch. It was like trying to hear a conversation that was far away and only getting bits of it through the wind. She knew this would happen, that the voices had warned her about it, but she still felt a deep loss. Father Thomas was interested in this change from a scientific point of view, but he also felt real empathy for the people involved. He saw a subtle sadness in Mary that she was trying to hide. It was a sadness that came before the loss of something that had become very important to her. He talked to her for a long time about how to deal with the change that was coming and how to keep what had been shared with others inside. Mary told Father Thomas something that shocked him during one of these talks. She said that losing the voices made her sad, but it also made her feel better in a way. The experience had been amazing, but it had also worn me out. Living all the time between two worlds, the visible and the invisible, the present and the distant past, took its toll. Part of her wanted to go back to a simpler life, one that was more grounded in the present. Father Thomas understood completely. He had felt the weight of seeing something so amazing, the duty of recording it correctly, and the difficulty of making sense of these events in light of what he already knew about the world. He wished he had never gone to that chapel on some nights so he could keep his simple, unquestioned faith. He also knew that he had changed in deep and lasting ways, and that he couldn't go back to being who he was before even if he wanted to. The other nuns, who were also sensitive to the voices, went through the change. For some, the silence came on very quickly and almost completely. During the winter, Sister Catherine had very vivid dreams. One morning, however, she woke up and couldn't remember her dreams. She went back to her normal sleep pattern without any memories. For some, like Sister Agnes, pieces stayed behind. Feelings that came up out of nowhere but weren't as clear or strong as they used to be. The Mother Superior called a meeting of the whole community to talk about what had happened over the winter and what to do next. It was a long and sometimes hard talk in which everyone was able to share their points of view. Some nuns admitted that they had never really believed in the voices and thought it was all just a kind of mass hysteria or psychological suggestion. Others strongly defended the truth of their experiences, saying that they had touched something truly otherworldly. Mary didn't say anything to defend or explain what she had been through. She just listened. She had reached a level of inner peace where she didn't need anyone else to tell her she was right. She knew what she had been through, and that it had been real for her in ways that couldn't be argued or proven. It didn't matter if other people believed it or not. It didn't change the truth of what she had been through. Father Thomas spoke next, and his point of view helped to calm things down a bit. He said that faith always requires a leap beyond absolute certainty, and that mystery is an important part of any real spiritual quest. The voices from the chapel, real or not in the objective sense, had served as catalysts for profound spiritual growth in many of those present. No matter how you looked at it, this fruit was real. Over the next few days, things in the chapel slowly got back to normal. They started their daily routines of praying, working, and studying again with new energy. But there was a small change in the mood, and the nuns' interactions were deeper than they had been before. Even people who didn't believe in the voices were affected by how strong the shared experience was during the winter. Mary made a new plan for her day. She still went to the chapel alone a lot and put her hands on the marked stones, but now she had different hopes. She didn't want to talk to him anymore. She just wanted to be there and honor what they had shared by being quiet. That was her way of saying thank you and recognizing the gift she had gotten. Father Thomas started getting ready to leave. The trails were clear now, and he knew he had things to do when he got back to the diocese. But he felt a lot of pressure to write his last report. How could he put months of amazing experiences into words that wouldn't sound completely crazy to bosses who hadn't seen any of it? How could he explain what had happened without making it seem less important or changing it? He chose to take a very balanced approach in his report. He would write down the things he could see, like the nuns' behavior changes and the symbols he found on the old stones. But when it came to the meanings, what it all meant on a deeper level, he would leave some things open to interpretation. He would say that he had seen something amazing, but he wouldn't say exactly what it was. He would let the mystery stay a mystery. Father Thomas talked to each nun one-on-one during the last week he was at the chapel. He wanted to know how each of them had been affected by the events of the winter. He found a wide range of interesting answers. Some people thought they had seen God, which made their faith much stronger. Some people had doubts they had never had before. Some people wanted to forget everything, while others wanted to remember every little thing. Of course, his last conversation was with Mary. They sat together in the chapel, which was now quiet in every way, and thought about the amazing journey they had taken together. Father Thomas asked Mary what she was going to do with what she had been through and how she was going to use it in her future life. Mary said she didn't have a clear plan. She said that the voices had taught her to be patient and let things happen when they were ready. Maybe she would write about what happened to her someday, or maybe she would just keep them to herself as a private treasure. It didn't matter what she would do with the memories. What mattered was how they had changed her on the inside. She felt more connected to the vastness of time and more aware that her life was just a small moment in a never-ending stream of life that went on long after she was born and died. Father Thomas saw wisdom in what they said. He had come to similar conclusions during his stay. The experience with the voices made him realize how unimportant he was in a way that was both humbling and freeing. He felt that his own life was more valuable, not less, because he knew that there were currents of meaning flowing through time that were much bigger than any one person. Everyone in the community came together for a formal goodbye on the morning of her departure. Father Thomas blessed each nun one at a time, giving them words of wisdom and encouragement. He held Mary's hands for a long time and looked her straight in the eyes when it was her turn. There was no need for him to say anything. They both knew they had shared something that would change them both forever. Mary stood at the window and watched Father Thomas leave as he walked down the mountain trail for the last time. She put a hand on the cold glass as a way to say goodbye and bless it. She knew that the priest had more than just his notes and papers with him. He also had a spark of what the voices had said. This spark could help people in other places understand, which would continue the work of preservation and transmission that the voices valued so highly. The chapel was quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't empty, it was full of memories and meaning that had built up over time. The stones kept their stories safe and sound, waiting for the next time the time was right to tell them again. And Mary, who had changed because of her experience, would continue her life as a monk with a level of understanding that few people ever reach. The mountain chapel was quiet and thoughtful for the next few years. Mary Whitlock stayed there, committed to the life she had chosen, but she had a level of experience that few people know about. Just because the voices were quiet didn't mean they were gone for good. It just meant that they had gone back to that deep state of dormancy where they would eventually come back, maybe in another generation or century. The Mother Superior lived there for a long time, and as the years went by, she became wiser and kinder. She never talked about what happened that amazing winter, but people who knew her well could tell that she had changed. Her eyes showed acceptance and a willingness to accept the unknown that hadn't been there before. She had learned that not everything needs to be explained to be respected. The other nuns, who had been through the same things, also went their own ways. Some stayed in the chapel until they died, while others left for other convents, taking with them memories they would always treasure. They all incorporated that experience into their own spiritual journeys in their own unique ways, letting the echoes of that winter be heard in the years that followed. Mary found that even though the voices didn't speak as clearly as they used to, she could always feel a presence in the chapel. It was like having a quiet friend who knew she wasn't really alone, even when she was. The marked stones stayed where they had always been, keeping their old secrets safe and waiting for the next cycle of revelation to come. New nuns came to the chapel over time. They were people who had never heard about what happened that winter. Mary sometimes thought about telling them about the voices and the strange things that happened in that place. But she always said no. If they were going to find the mystery, each person had to find their own way to it. Making these experiences happen or setting expectations could only change what would happen on its own. Mary sometimes felt a brief connection with the voices, especially during the winters that followed. Not as strongly as that first winter, but enough to remind her that the connection had never really been broken. It was like keeping in touch with a friend who lives far away and only writes once in a while, but their friendship stays the same even when they don't write. The chapel still served its purpose as a place to pray and think. People who only climbed the mountain once or twice said that there was something special about that space, an atmosphere of peace that went beyond just how beautiful the buildings were. Some people said they felt strangely moved, but didn't know why. Mary always smiled when she heard these things because she knew that the place still moved people in small ways. The symbols on the old stones stayed the same, even though they had been worn down by time. People who knew where to look could still see them. Mary often touched them while praying, which had become a part of her spiritual practice. She didn't look for messages or revelations anymore. She just kept a respectful connection with the layers of history that were there. Mary learned over the years that her experience with the voices had changed her view of time. She didn't think of her life as separate from others. Instead, she thought of it as part of a larger current that has been going on for generations. The people who lived long ago and worshipped that mountain, the people who built the chapel, and herself, as well as everyone who would come after her, were all part of the same story, all looking for a connection to something bigger than themselves. This knowledge gave me a deep sense of peace. Mary was no longer afraid of death, as she may have been before. She knew it was just a change, and that her own mind would eventually join the invisible currents of memory and presence that flowed through places like that chapel. Maybe one day she would be one of the voices, telling stories to someone who was willing to listen. The Appalachian Mountains Chapel is still a quiet and mysterious place today. The stones still tell their stories, waiting for the seasons and years to pass. And maybe in the future, when the weather is right and someone with the right sensitivity is there, the voices will rise again and share their old memories with a new group of people. This is the story of Mary Whitlock and the voices she heard coming from the walls. A tale about the depth of time, the layers of meaning that build up in certain places, and the bravery it takes to stay open to the unknown. It reminds us that the world is much bigger and stranger than what we see every day. There are currents of meaning all around us, if we only have ears to hear and hearts to understand. If this trip through the mountain secrets moved you, think about subscribing to the channel for more stories that look at the strange and dark parts of being human. Each story is a door to worlds that are different from ours, where the impossible becomes possible and things that have been lost find their voice again.